Hello, and welcome to the JCC of Metro Detroit's 70th Annual Detroit Jewish Book Fair year. My name is Suzanne Simon, and I'm the co-chair of the Book Fair Steering Committee, and it's my pleasure to welcome you on this Sunday afternoon to our celebration of Women's History Month, featuring When Women Invented Television with author Jennifer Keishin Armstrong. To see our full event schedule, watch events you may have missed, and find our online store where you can find When Women Invented Television and plenty of other hand-selected books and gifts, visit our website at culturalarts.jccdet.org/bookfair. If you enjoy this event and other book fair events, please consider becoming a patron or donating to Book Fair. You can do either or both at our website, culturalarts.jccdet.org/bookfair. We rely on community support to make these events possible, and so thank you in advance for becoming part of our family. I want to extend our deepest gratitude to the whole Book Fair Committee. Your dedication, commitment, and hard work make programs like this possible. We have an exciting event for you this afternoon, and we want you to be part of it. You can ask questions and offer comments in the YouTube comment section below or by texting the number in the corner of your screen. Our speakers have a great discussion prepared, and they will take as many of your questions as they can. While you're here at our YouTube channel, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and click the reminder bell. That way you won't miss any of our exciting events. The focus of today's event is When Women Invented Television, the untold story of the female powerhouses who pioneered the way we watch TV today. We have with us the author of the book, Jennifer Keishin Armstrong, as well as local freelance journalist Laura Berman, who will moderate the discussion. It was the golden age of radio, and powerful men were making millions in advertising dollars, reaching thousands of listeners every day. When television arrived, few radio moguls were interested in the upstart industry with its tiny production budgets and expensive television sets that were out of reach for most families. But 4 women, each an independent visionary, saw an opportunity to carve their own paths. In doing so, they invented the way we watch TV today. But as the medium became more popular and lucrative in the wake of World War II, and as politics, sexism, racism, antisemitism, and money collided, these women who invented television found themselves fighting from the margins as men took control. But these women never gave up. When Women Invented Television reclaims their forgotten histories and the work they did to pioneer the medium that now rules our lives. Jennifer Keishin Armstrong has written 7 books, including the New York Times bestseller Seinfeldia. Formerly a staff writer at Entertainment Weekly, where she worked for a decade, her writing appears in many publications, including BBC Culture, the New York Times Book Review, Vice, New York Magazine, and Billboard. She created and co-hosts 2 podcasts, Pop Literacy, about pop culture-related books, and Dead Writer Drama, examining classic writers through a modern lens. She also curates and writes the weekly Peabody Finds, a recommendation newsletter for the prestigious Peabody Awards in Broadcasting. Laura Berman is an award-winning Detroit-based journalist and writer. She was a featured columnist at the Detroit News for almost 30 years. Since retiring from the Detroit News, Laura has developed expertise as a professional writing coach, working with private clients through the Detroit Writing Room, and students at the University of Michigan. A graduate of the University of Michigan, she is married to fellow journalist Brian Dickerson. Please join me in welcoming Jennifer Armstrong and Laura Berman.
Hi there. Jennifer, it's so nice to meet you after reading your book, which is really remarkable, witty, fun to read, and really illuminating in a lot of ways. So I'm excited to have this opportunity to talk to you and share this with our listeners. I thought I'd start with just talking about how you got to this particular group of 4 women. You've got Gertrude Berg, Betty White, Hazel Scott, and Erna Phillips. And I think of those 4, my mom knew who Gertrude Berg was, but I really don't. And I think Betty White, of course, we all know, but I think you show a very different side of her. So could you just explain a little bit about who these women are and where they came from?
Yes, absolutely. And it is like just the process of choosing these 4 women it was huge in itself. So I had some inklings of this time in television history and women in it back when I wrote a book about the Mary Tyler Moore Show. And it was published in 2013. So it was like the early 2010s when I was researching it. But that show was in the 70s. It's very female centric. So I was kind of like looking back a couple decades before it in terms of TV history, just to sort of get up to tell that story, and learned a couple things where I went like, oh, I didn't really know that, including like a huge one was Gertrude Berg. I had asked the creators of the Mary Tyler Moore Show, James L. Brooks and Alan Burns, who the inspirations were for the character of Rhoda, who was Mary's best friend. And she was kind of this brash Jewish woman from New York City, right? And I was obsessed with Rhoda. And so I asked about this, and they mentioned Gertrude as one of several of their kind of inspirations for that character in a broad sense, obviously. But, kind of the confident Jewish woman. And I said, I don't know who that is, so I looked her up and was like, I can't believe if you read about her, it's clear how famous she was. And it was very strange for me. I fancied myself kind of a, TV history nerd. So I was like, how is this possible? And then they had also mentioned that Betty White's character on the Mary Tyler Moore Show, who was Sue Ann Nivens, the happy homemaker. She has kind of her own homemaking show on this local channel where Mary's character works. And they said that they had described this character when they wrote her as a Betty White type. And I was like, wait, I actually don't know what that means, because my first impression of Betty White was on the Mary Tyler Moore Show. And I didn't know there was a Betty White type before that. And it turned out this was kind of like a very funny riff on her previous career, which was that she was one of the first daytime talk show hosts. And she was incredibly it's just like super sweet kind of persona. She would sing these lovely songs right into the camera and wear these frilly dresses. So I thought like, oh, I didn't know. And then if you look a little deeper, even you realize she was producing that show. It was totally unscripted. She was on 5.5 hours a day, 6 days a week. It was one of the first talk shows ever. And while she was doing that, she also co-created, starred in, and produced her own sitcom. And this was also around the time of Gertrude Berg. So I was starting to go like, there's something going on at this time that I did not know about at all, because I used to think Lucille Ball was like that she was the one woman, that it was just sort of this coincidence, or like that she was super, I mean, she was special, of course. I don't mean to say she wasn't, but I always used to think like, my God, it's so strange that the first sort of big bang of modern television is a woman, right? That's incredible. And it is, but the fact was that it turned out that many women were actually working both in the camera and behind the scenes in these early years when TV was not as sort of like, it wasn't the main source of entertainment and everything for Americans. Radio was. So it was kind of this Wild West time when they were trying out a lot of stuff. And it turned out that a lot of women sort of had this intuitive sense that like, maybe if I get over there early, I can kind of, get my foot in, do some stuff, make a mark there. And so women, and actually people of color too, there was more than you think at that time. So this is about 1948 to 1955. Once I decided I was going to pursue this as a book, I made a big list of all the women from this time who were doing this kind of thing. And I sort of narrowed it down a few ways. One was that I wanted when women invented television. Like that was always my title. And I wanted it to be women who actually made a creative, traceable contribution to the form that they were working in. So a lot of fabulous women were working then. You know, a Gracie Allen is a good example, but not quite. And we could argue about that later, you know, like if she really did. But the point is, you know, I was looking for, or Audrey Meadows is a really good example from The Honeymooners. People like to mention her to me, and she was fabulous. But I really wanted this creative contribution to be clear. And then I was also looking for a range of experiences. So, you know, you have Gertrude Berg, who is a Jewish woman. She's shooting her show live in New York. She created one of the first family sitcoms, and she's in her 50s by the time she's doing this, because she had a whole run the same show as a radio star. So that was kind of one example. So her children are grown, but she had children. Then I had Betty White, who, you know, we just talked a little bit about what she was doing. So she was working more in daytime for the most part, but also had her sitcom. And she was single by design, which we can talk about more. She was deliberately single. She had been married twice already and divorced her second husband because he did not want a working wife. And she chose her career deliberately. So that was a different thing. And then Hazel Scott, who is a Black woman, and she was the first Black person to have a primetime national show of any kind of her own. And that's incredible, and it's often forgotten. And so she's a Black woman. She was a musician primarily. She was a jazz musician, really, really talented and very, very glamorous. She was around 30 years old. So was Betty. And she was married to Adam Clayton Powell Jr., who was a very famous congressman from Harlem. And so she shot her show in New York, and that was, you know, prime time. So that was a couple different, had a young child that she was, you know, juggling with her career on television. And then, Erna Phillips. Phillips. Erna Phillips was really kind of an outlier in a variety of ways, but I loved that about her. She was working mostly in Chicago. She insisted, kept trying to get her to go to New York or LA, and she tried it a little bit. She hated it. She's from Chicago. She actually created the entire soap opera genre. She did it first for radio and was outrageously successful at it. She kind of had an empire on radio of daytime soap operas, including The Guiding Light, which she eventually brought over to television successfully. But she had this really unique experience where not only was she in Chicago, but she was raising two children who she had adopted as a single woman, which I was surprised that could even be done at this time, around 1950. Mm-hmm. And later it actually got harder.
I think a lot of movie stars did that.
Yeah. And I mean, you know,
Joan Crawford.
Right, exactly. And she was a woman of means, right? So right. She could do this. And of course, it was two things that are very similar to someone like Joan Crawford, where she had the means and she also really was busy running her empire. And so it was very hard. She really actually, I mean, by her own account, at least, really very much would have loved to get married. She was obsessed mm-hmm. her whole life with having not given her children a male role model. This really bothered her. And she believed in kind of traditional marriage, but she was too successful. She was too busy running her empire to meet anyone. And so she had this extremely unique experience. And of course she's the one that of my four that was not really in front of the camera at all, but was just this incredible powerhouse. I just couldn't resist her. She had so much interesting life experience. So those are the four, and that's basically how I came up with them.
But you pretty much left out Lucille Ball, I guess, because she's not a forgotten woman. Would that be exactly. the reason?
Yeah, and I actually conceived, like, there's a fair amount of information about Lucy in the book, and I kind of conceived her as like this background character, or like this was almost a direct reaction to her. Like, this was like pre-Lucy it's not really pre, but like it's, you know, it's some of it is pre-Lucy. And the idea is like, there were these women, they all sort of started before Lucy was another thing, technically speaking, even though she shows up about halfway through here.
Right.
So that was part of the point, was like, no one look right now. There's this like crazy explosion of Lucy content all of a sudden. So it's extremely clear that no one needed me to write another Lucy thing. We just had that, the movie, and now there's a documentary movie that Amy Poehler directed that's coming out now called Lucy and Desi. So like Lucy is very well covered territory, and I really think it's like interesting though to see that stuff, because I think that this book gives like the rest of the context that is kind of surrounding that story.
Have you had any nibbles on your material?
I have, but it's still available. So if anyone wants,
because there were some wonderful, there are some really good stories in there. You mentioned that 20, you know, this really struck me, the statistic early on in the book about 25% of the creative work was being done by women early on, and that's the same number as now. And I assume that it really fell off at some point.
It really did. The thing is, it's actually, I mean, it's definitely true that it fell off, but it's hard to even fully trace, because that 25% that I did was like my own count. There was no, I mean, probably not shocking for people to hear that no one was like doing statistical analysis of how many women were working behind the scenes in 1948 on television. So that's kind of my own, but it was so limited what was on that you could kind of, I sat one day and made a list from, you know, just doing online research and did a rough count, versus, you know, then from then until the 70s is when is the first time anyone does any kind of official count, when the Writers Guild did a count, and it's way lower. I do not remember the exact thing, but it is, you know, it's something like 5% or something like that. So, and then, you know, from then on, there are official counts being done, and you can see, you know, that it's always this struggle to sort of get back. And it's really funny, because I do feel like we're at kind of a high at this point. You know, it certainly hasn't been any better than now. So it's really interesting that during these early days, like it was just like now, like when we have Shonda Rhimes and, you know, Tina Fey and all of these people making great television.
So you suggest that there was kind of the political undercurrent as we went from the 40s to the 50s, McCarthyism, antisemitism, just a general conservative ice flow kind of helped freeze women out. Was that a fair reading? Or
Absolutely, yeah. I kind of date it to about 1955. I feel like the 50s, at least on television, the 50s essentially start in 1955, which this is often true of a lot of decades, where our idea of that time is very different, doesn't quite line up with what was happening in those years exactly. And 55 is like, to give people a benchmark to, like, by this time we've got like Father Knows Best, which I kind of also see as the absolute quintessential 1950s television. And like, it's literally called Father Knows Best. You can't it's called like patriarchy, you know. It's actually a very like sweet and entertaining show. I recently rewatched some of it, and I was like, oh, I see how many people like this. It's cute. But it is very much that, like, literally called Father Knows Best. We learn a silly lesson in 30 minutes. Mom is, you know, vacuuming with the beautiful skirt and pearls, and, you know, here's your drink, dear, and the whole thing. So as we are going from like that 48, which is roughly when I start the book, to 55, what happens is we get another wave. This came in waves, and it was going, you know, it had been going before, and it kind of dies, right? Yeah, actually, they killed McCarthyism, right? TV finally kills McCarthyism, actually, right, in 1955. But there's still another big wave and a big push, and a specific one that is aimed at television, and which really shows you they knew this thing was going to be powerful. So the 1950 wave, which is, I didn't know this until I was writing this book, so I will explain it briefly, that, like, at least in this case, the way that this particular wave of McCarthyism, which is actual McCarthyism involving Joe McCarthy, happened. And before that, it was not. Like, during the, you know, when the sort of more famous wave that hit movies, it actually wasn't Joe McCarthy. But this was full on McCarthy. Like, what happened was there would be these groups that would put out a list. It really was a list. And in this case, and they would put out this thing in like a pamphlet form. It was called Red Channels. And they would just list a bunch of people that they were like, we think these people may be communists. And they even said when they were pushed on it, they'd say like, well, we're not sure. We just think maybe. And which is not cool. And what they would do is just sort of like put it out there, kind of like now you might put something on Twitter and be like, I mean, I'm just saying this person might be terrible, but you do what you want with this, public. So it was very similar in that way. And it would just, you know, it listed a bunch of people, and two of my women were sort of hit really, really hard by this. One was Hazel Scott, who was on the list, and Gertrude Berg, whose TV husband, Philip Loeb, was on this 1950 list.
I loved how you described her as blacklist adjacent.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And you can't prove anything about any of this stuff, but it's like, I'm pretty suspicious that, you know, he was a great target for them because he was Jewish and he was a huge labor activist. He was a pioneering labor activist in the acting community, in, you know, theater mostly was where he started. And he is he is part of a group that is responsible for things like actors being able to make a living wage and getting benefits. So they really did not like him. So they went after him. And, you know, but this could also really undermine a powerful woman like Gertrude in the process, because, you know, and it did, because they demanded that, you know, her sponsor demanded that she fire him. She said no.
She was controlling the show. She was the producer and owner of the show, right? Yeah.
Exactly. So, I mean, I guess she could have just rolled over right away and said, sure, I'll fire him, and went on and still been successful. But you know, she tried for a while behind the scenes to strike a deal with General Foods, who was her sponsor, to, you know, to keep him on the show, and it just didn't work, and it kept her off the air at a critical time. It was like right when the Goldbergs her show was at its absolute heights of popularity. And my favorite fact about this is that she stayed off the air. She was supposed to come back the following fall and be paired with I Love Lucy. They were both on CBS. And so it was going to be Monday night. I always think of it as like, it was going to be the first kind of must-see TV, right? And you have to think at the time that they were thinking, oh, the Goldbergs is popular, it'll help this new show, I Love Lucy. Lucy comes on the air, it is pretty much an instant hit. And we all know what happened, right? And it could have been that both of them were together. And, you know, I think that Gertrude should be up there with Lucy, but instead it knocks the momentum right out of the show, and it's never quite the same. And she actually ends up losing the battle and finally coming back on the air, but replacing her husband, and never quite.
She does try to take a stand on his behalf and to hold out.
Really did. And I had to work pretty hard to even piece all this together, because it was something that she didn't talk about afterwards. It was really something, and a lot of the stuff was going on just behind the scenes, but she's very much this middle ground character in Blacklist history, where she got a lot of flack kind of historically for essentially, because it looks like in the end she did roll over, you know, she did give in to this pressure and hire a new husband. On the other hand, she really put her career on the line for a while and tried. And it's like so close. It's like there's a different, very inspiring movie that could have happened in a different timeline if just one thing went differently. She had threatened to go public and try to lead a boycott, but she didn't quite do it. So there were just these like slightly missed opportunities for everyone. If General Foods had just gone with it, I think no one cared. This is the other thing about this, is that both for Hazel Scott, whose show is immediately canceled after she's blacklisted and she speaks out, and Gertrude Berg, both of them, you know, there was actually no public outcry. No one said, you know, we're not going to watch this show anymore. I don't think most of the public, think of similar things now, like that are like deeply political, where it's like the political people think it matters and the people in the industry are too scared to find out what the answer is. But the fact is, no one in the public was saying like, we don't want to see Philip Loeb on television. I mean, he had just been voted something like, you know, America's favorite dad by the Boy Scouts or something. So like most people didn't care, you know, and even when Gertrude went through all of this, she eventually sort of cut ties with CBS, which was her original network. And she took the next time when she came back on the air, it was with NBC. And the fact is, when NBC first hired her, all of the memos indicate, and I read their internal memos, you know, all of the memos indicate they actually didn't know, which is kind of crazy. Like they signed her being like, why wouldn't we want her? She's great. I don't know why CBS doesn't want her. And then afterwards, it sort of slowly dawns on them, like, why are we having trouble getting a sponsor for this show? And that's when they're kind of like, oh, this blacklist thing happened. It sounds crazy, but it seems to be true that this was the case. So
it's just really chilling.
Yeah, it's just that people got scared the minute they heard this stuff. And so that was like the big conservative, the clear, like, there's no doubt about it. This is what happened to these women. But even like Betty White and Erna Phillips, who I think dealt with less, partly because they were out of New York and partly because they were in daytime, so there wasn't as much attention. I would also point out there's a very clear thing here, which is Gertrude Berg is a Jewish woman and like extremely Jewish in the sense that her show was about a Jewish family that was overtly Jewish. They had,
and you make the point that was like the only overtly Jewish show for about 30 years.
Right, exactly. So she's, you know, it's important to also note, of course, part of why they were targeted is this is a Jewish woman and a Black woman. You know, we can't deny that, like, Betty White is also a white Protestant woman. And Erna was actually Jewish, but like was not in front of the camera. And actually most of her shows were about Catholic families. So I think like all of those reasons are why these two other women kind of fly more under the radar, but even they had trouble as the 50s progressed, you know. Betty was sort of doing fine, and then she gets this great opportunity to have a national daytime talk show after she had been local in Los Angeles for several years and very successful at it. And her show kind of gets nitpicked to death by male executives who are starting to come in from radio, you know, and it's like she's been there the whole time inventing the form, being on the air 5.5 hours a day, 6 days a week. And when she first came over to NBC, they were like, you have to do an hour every day. Do you think you can do that? And she just laughed and was like, yeah, I think I can handle that. But they really did kind of like, you know, they were very baffled by like, what do women want? I literally read a memo where it was men writing to other men back and forth about what dames want in their daytime television. They determined that dames generally want emotional upsets. So they were trying to know how to do that. Actually, Erna Phillips can tell you that dames do enjoy emotional upsets sometimes. She was making soap operas based on that. But, and, you know, Erna Phillips too, like it was astounding to see how much she had to fight. She was a woman, I mean, she was making, just for reference, in the 40s, when she had a radio empire, she was making $250,000 a year in 1940s money. That's like $10 million now. You know, so it's like, you know, she was making a ton of money. She was super
successful. Was writing soap operas, basically.
She was writing several soap operas. I mean, she was just hugely successful at this and had invented the form. And still, when she wanted to bring it over to television, she was constantly second guessed, and she had to twice finance her own pilot episodes to show that it would work. And once she would do something, everyone else would do what she did, and she would be successful, but then they would all be successful too. When she wanted to take it from 15 minutes to 30 minutes for the first time, they were like, that won't work. And then she finally did her own pilot episode at 30, put it on.
And then she ended up having to fund her own pilot.
Yeah, twice. And it's just, they were constantly like kind of second guessing her approach and everything. And it's like, this woman obviously knew her audience and knew what they wanted. And the men were happy to make the money off of it once it worked, but they were constantly like, you know, like writing these memos, like, are you sure? I don't really think this is going to work, that kind of thing. So they too were really victims of this. And like Betty lost her show after a year because they couldn't make it work. And she ended up, you know, they replaced her with Tennessee Ernie Ford, who was a male pop singer. And she sort of had to go do other things. And that's why people like me kind of don't really realize, you know, she pops back up in a big way in the 70s. on the Mary Tyler Moore Show. But, you know, it's like, you know, people forget about this time in her career when she was like a pioneer.
I want to get back to Hazel Scott a little bit, but I wanted to ask you about the technology and how that affected your research, because so much, I didn't realize how much of television then was actually performed literally live.
Yes.
And even using a few cameras was a big innovation. And I wonder, did you, like, were you sitting in the William Paley Broadcast Museum? Some of this stuff was available.
Yes.
Like, could you see the Goldbergs or?
Now the Goldbergs is the easiest. The Goldbergs is actually not all of it. There's big swaths of it that are missing, but even some of the really early ones, which are the best stuff, are available. They're not great because they're on what was called kinescope. This was how they would do reruns, is that they'd point. It's like more modern times when someone would take like a video camera to a movie theater and bootleg a movie. It was similar. It was like they'd point a camera at a monitor that was on the set live. And so they'd make like a bad copy. So it's not great, but it exists. And you can actually order, I have the Goldbergs on DVD. Like I have the complete DVD set. And so you can get, so you can see, you know, and you can also just look it up online and you'll find a variety of episodes and times, but the ones that are best preserved and look the best and are most available are the ones where it's toward the end, it becomes syndicated, they go on film, they're not live anymore, and that's why they look good. And it's when the Goldbergs have moved to the suburbs, so it's kind of like its worst period.
It sounded kind of sad.
It gets really, really weird and sad by the end, because it loses, the whole point was supposed to be this kind of middle-class Jewish family in a Bronx tenement, and by the end it's trying to become Father Knows Best, and it's not Father Knows Best, so it's just kind of sad. So that's the Goldbergs. You know, you can find some of the soaps. I went and watched the soaps at Paley, and it's so fun because it's just these 15-minute little segments and the ads are insane. And then Betty,
were they, because they were doing product placement then? Were they doing product placement for those, or was
I wouldn't call it that exactly. It's just that they were like more. It's almost more like the way podcasts are done now, where you know it's sort of it's in the it's in the thing. You know, it's not product placement. It's not like the person is using Ivory soap. It's that they sort of stop and there's like a little dramatic. You know, and they kind of match the tone of the show a lot. So like, you know, there's great spots about like this woman whose husband doesn't like her fried chicken until she uses Crisco and stuff like that. Very cheap, like you cannot believe it's real, and it's just very 1950s. And a lot of like weight loss, weird stuff. Yeah. So, and then, so that's Erna and Betty's like first show, which is Hollywood on Television. The Los Angeles one you can't find, and it is such a travesty because I think that there was a treasure trove there of celebrity guests and things like that from that time. She talks about several times Buster Keaton came on and would just do like weird improv with them and stuff. But her talk show, her NBC national talk show from 1954 is available, and you can look that up online as well. It's very delightful. It's lots of her, like she does singing, some dancing sometimes, and, you know, interviewing.
Is she banter? Is there banter or not so much?
She banters with like the people on the set. It's very, it's interesting. Cause like, and sometimes it's not like you can't see them. She's just bantering with like her crew. But she's Betty White. You can see it right away. You get it. She used to talk about how, she had this kind of special talent for looking right into the camera and talking to the audience or singing to the audience. And she used to talk about how she would look into the camera and think of it as a lover. And you can see that. You can see why she was so good on camera when you see this stuff. And Hazel's the one that's really a travesty, because that is completely nowhere. As far, I mean, there is a feeling that there might be a stash out there, but it has not been located yet. There are some clues, but no one's found it as far as I know quite yet. But this is a funny time in TV because they actually didn't realize people were going to they didn't even know about reruns yet. So like you said, most of it was live. And so they just recorded on kinescope, and often kind of like in our early days of like having videotapes in our house where they just tape over something because they needed to store something else. And so they really did not preserve Hazel's show. And that is like, that would be jazz history too, among other things, to have the show. So the only way I know what happened on that show is that Variety, the trade publication, reviewed stuff pretty religiously. You'd get like a review almost every week of some shows, and this was one of them. So, and they would describe what happened. So I have a sense of what happened on the show, but haven't been able to see the exact thing. I mean, it was a pretty simple show. It was usually her performing with her band.
And Hazel Scott, just to remind everyone, Hazel Scott, because I think she's pretty obscure. I haven't found anyone who remembers her yet. But she was an incredibly beautiful Juilliard-trained pianist, singer, glamorous performer, and a remarkable person. I mean, she deserves
Really?
a book of her own, really.
I mean, all these women do. The only reason I put them together was to trick you into, to trick more people into reading it. And Betty was really my Trojan horse. I didn't say that when I was talking about the four, but like, I kind of understood, like, she's obviously famous and that people would at least know who she was, but I really wanted it to be mostly hidden figures for television. But Betty was kind of my, like, don't you want to know about young Betty White? But yeah, Hazel is one that, to me, I mean, Hazel and Gertrude shock me in particular, because I cannot emphasize enough how famous these women were in their time. I always say that Gertrude was kind of an Oprah figure because she kind of had an empire. It was like there was the Goldbergs, but she really traded on her image as a Jewish mother, as the quintessential greatest Jewish mother. And so she had things like,
she didn't cook.
Right. She didn't cook, but she had a very successful cookbook that's still in print. That's how successful it was. Even though this woman did not cook at home. And she had, similarly, a line of house dresses, like affordable house dresses. And this is a woman who dressed to the nines when she was off. But she'd go put on her house dress and go promote it at, department stores to the women who loved her. And so she was kind of like, had this Oprah thing, but I would say that, and I don't think I'm, overstating this, Hazel was kind of like Beyonce of her time. She was, like you said, I highly recommend just go Google Hazel Scott and look on YouTube, and you can see a lot of video of her performing, at least, which is basically what she would do on her show. And she is, I mean, you just want to watch her, and the camera loves her. She's gorgeous. And she had a thing where she really was dedicated to a very glamorous image. Like, she thought this was super important as a Black woman. So she presented herself just impeccably. And the set kind of was always described as looking kind of like a penthouse on Park Avenue. And she was married to this very charismatic, very handsome congressman who was a huge personality as well. And they did a lot of activism together. So things they would do, I mean, some of it very much deliberately, would be things like she asked to perform at the Daughters of the American Revolution Hall in DC at a time when she knew they did not accept Black people. And so she knew they'd say no. And that was their plan, is that they're going to say no, then we're going to go to the press, which they did. And this was a big event, and it got the president involved in everything. Did not change the policy right away there, but like certainly had this impact. She wouldn't play segregated venues. So if she went to a venue when she was on tour, she saw it was segregated, she'd walk right back out and call the press. So this was, she was an incredibly glamorous and brave and cool and talented woman, and kind of had everything going. And then this blacklist thing happened, which you can see why it happened to her because of this. And she couldn't just take it. And so she asked to go before the House Un-American Activities Committee, which almost no one did. Most people were running the other way, and she was begging to go. And her husband was like, you could just not, is another idea. But she could not just let this go. And so they actually were not going to let her come at first because they knew what was going to happen. And, she actually called a press conference and said, they won't let me come, so I'm going to read you what I was going to tell them. And this makes a big enough deal that they're finally like, fine, just come, let's do the thing. And she reads this sort of blistering speech and tells them all the things they're doing wrong, tells a bunch of white men. And this is still Jim Crow South. This is still,
Right.
You have to think about the context of this time. It's really extraordinary. This Black woman goes before a bunch of white Southern men and explains to them all the things they're doing wrong. And it's an event. And she looks, put together and glamorous as always, and gives this incredible speech. And, the Black press goes bananas. They just loved this, which they should. And it didn't get as much play in, in mainstream white media.
Which is unfortunate. Yeah.
Classic though. And
Yes.
then just kind of unceremoniously, I mean, it's such a shame because it's like you can almost see the movie happening in front of your eyes and you want it to go a different way because you can see her going up before the committee. And then it just like is the saddest possible ending because, and this is why we don't know about her, I think, because she goes home and kind of just like things start falling apart. People are mad at her. She gets a call and says like, and it's just like, well, that show that was doing better and better and better every week, remember that one? You don't have it anymore. And they really actually said to her that they were canceling it just in anticipation of like, we just don't want any trouble. It's like, but there hasn't been any trouble of that kind. Like there's been no trouble. No one is having trouble. But they just canceled it. And she actually tried to sue them later for this and didn't really get anywhere. But it's such a like the exact opposite of what you hope would have happened. Just she tried to get the rest of the industry to just boycotts essentially, boycott anybody who was blacklisting people. Couldn't get, it's just they couldn't. I always have this vision of like if all these women could have gotten together, it could have been different, but they were so bogged down in their own problems and so isolated from each other. There weren't women's groups. There wasn't a women in television group then.
I think you really showed that their isolation and that they sort of had to grit their teeth and bear it pretty much all the time. They had very little support.
Right.
And they paid tremendous personal cost, really. Just about all of them.
Yeah. Exactly. I mean, a huge theme, which is kind of a bummer. I think these women are really inspiring. And I think that's why in the end, it's great to read about them because it's just inspiring. But, the amount of times like all of them end up basically in the hospital at some point, suffering from physical symptoms that we would now clearly recognize.
And with the exception of Betty White, they die very young.
Yes, exactly. And Betty's the only one that doesn't actively end up in the hospital either. She really, I think she had a special personality. And she also had, she lived at home with her parents because she had left her second husband. Great move because this gives her two wives essentially, right? They're making her meals. They're keeping house, and she had a great relationship with her parents who must have been extraordinary because think of that time and your daughter says, I've divorced my second husband so I could choose my career. And from all of her accounts, it sounds like they were like great. And they would help her with jokes and she would, she loved having breakfast with them, even though it was at like 5 a.m. They'd get up and have breakfast. They had dogs together in the house. And it sounds like, I think that's a huge part of her resilience in that time is that she had this really special support system that seems like
dogs and parents
and parents who for some reason were like, we're totally into you being a single working woman. We want you to do well and we love you. And I think that made a huge difference for her in both her resilience at the time and her outlook and personality going forward.
Right. I want to just encourage our listeners out there, viewers, to ask questions. If you have any questions for Jennifer about her book or about anything you'd like to ask her about early television or entertainment in general, because she's an expert on Seinfeldia, I think we call it. And the Mary Tyler Moore Show, and you've written books about a number of entertainment subjects.
Yes.
The Mickey Mouse Club.
Yes, that's true. That was a while ago, so it might be tested my memory if you ask about that. But I got the broad strokes down at least. Sex and the City, And Do you know if we can see questions?
Oh, there are questions
If
and
you
I was
click
missing them.
comments, you just have to click
Okay.
over from the private.
Oh, I'm
I
sorry.
just realized it myself. So
Yeah, somehow I was on, you have to switch. I'm so sorry. So, let's go through a few of them because
yeah,
we
let's do
need
it.
to. Rob asks, can you comment on the early years of variety shows, which were overwhelmingly male driven and also had many Jewish male stars? How did women finally get their foot in the door?
Yeah, it's absolutely true. And I mean, variety shows were it. Like that's a such good context for this whole thing is like before, especially Gertrude and some other, Gertrude and Lucy and et cetera came in. It was primarily variety shows. And you can kind of figure out why when you think about it. It's like if we're broadcasting live from New York, the variety show makes sense because, we're still used to vaudeville. A lot of vaudevillians are kind of flowing straight through radio and into television. And also like it's a loose format. You don't have to memorize a script the way that when Gertrude, it's always extraordinary to me watching those early Goldbergs because they're doing it live and they had a lot of tricks. Costume changes and stuff. They'd like layer costumes and run off, take one off, run back in. Look, it's the next day. And so they didn't have to do that if it was a variety show. They would just have to have, looser, I'm going to do a monologue. There's some song and dance. And that's where you get, Milton Berle is the classic here, right? And I love him because he's actually very good friends with Gertrude and loved her. And she was on his show several times as her character, Molly Goldberg, and was always incredibly popular when she would do this. In fact, when she was kept off the air for a while because of the blacklist, one of her tricks was she would go be on Milton Berle and kind of stoke people's love for her again. And so they had a great relationship. And but he's the quintessential example of white male Jewish men hosting these shows. And it was harder, as women could be on as guests, like I said, and often were, but it's hard and that's why somebody like Hazel, who had a different kind of show, she wasn't telling jokes, she wasn't doing gags, she was performing her own work for the most part, but still, that's why she was such a big deal. It's hard to tell exactly because there's not good records from her show, and the reason is it was on a network called Dumont. It was the fourth network, and so there's not like an archive the way I was able to actually read memos in the NBC archive from that time because everything's preserved. So it's hard to know why they hired her, but you can make some pretty good guesses. And one thing is Dumont seemed to be more open to women and people of color. And the reason is they were a fourth network. And this is a classic thing. We've seen it all the way through TV history, all the way up till networks in more recent times like UPN and the WB. They often start by catering to what is seen as a niche audience, even though it obviously should not be seen as that. And then they almost always move out of it when they become more popular. But they seemed more open to this. And I think that that's a huge reason why they were open to Hazel. And she was incredibly popular and she's beautiful and charismatic and all of this stuff. So she was a little bit risky. They knew she was outspoken before they hired her. They didn't know she was going to be blacklisted, but they certainly knew she might cause some trouble here and there. And so they knew that, but they also were kind of making a bet. Like she's also really cool and popular and everybody loves her. And they started her, another really important thing that I don't think I mentioned is they started her locally in New York City one night a week. And she was so popular, they moved her to 3 nights a week. And she was so popular, they moved her to national. So that's another way it was very more common than now that local was more important. So you kind of work your way up through the system. So she proved herself. And it was going great is the thing. Like all of that variety coverage, it was like every week they were saying like, we need more. Like they loved her. And it was like, I remember a review literally said like, we need more Hazel Scott on television. And I always think of like an alternate history where if she could have stayed on, Nat King Cole is usually recognized as the first Black person to have his own variety show. And it was more in this vein that we're talking about. And it was at a time in the mid 50s when more people had television. And so they all know about it, but she was before him.
Another question from our audience, Naomi asked, if if Betty White, and I was wondering about this, did Betty White know about the book, or did you have, it doesn't seem as if you had a chance to interview her at all. I know she was.
No, I mean, her people knew about it, and I mean, I can't guarantee she personally knew, but her people knew about it, and they were lovely. And it's just that, I mean, honestly, when I was doing this book, she was 98, and
Well, sometimes 98-year-olds are fine. But
absolutely. But we're talking about a 98-year-old and also asking her to remember 1948. And so they kind of just said, like, I sent them questions, and they literally, I'm not making this up, his answer, and I thought it was sort of sweet. He was like, Betty is 98. When I sent the questions, I was like, if she feels like, which I really appreciate, just because it would be awful to sit in an interview where someone just says, like, I don't know. Right. And I have talked to her previously. I talked to her for my Mary Tyler Moore Show book, among other things. And people always like to know these things. And yes, she is perfect. She's an absolute delight. And even then, though, I remember, and this is, 10 years ago, talking about the 1970s. And I even remember her kind of being sweet then. And sometimes I'd ask her like a certain detail, and she'd be like, oh, honey, I have no idea. But she also told some really, really lovely stories from that time. And I know that time in her career was really important to her. So I have spoken with her before. She did know about it. And like, I had I had something that was just so lucky. This was a lot of archival research. And I found she had a friend who was a journalist in this time period in the 40s and 50s. And she was a freelance journalist. And what she seemed to do was, like, she'd interview Betty, take all the notes, and then try to sell a story about it. So she has the actual notes from the interviews that she did contemporaneously during this period of her life. And she was a friend. And she has an archive at the Oscar archives at the Margaret Herrick Library in LA. And so I was able to use these interviews that a friend did during the actual time it was happening. And so it's really lovely, because this is where she's pretty honest about some things. This is, she felt comfortable to say, like, oh, I am not getting married again. I'm not doing that. Let me tell you all the ways you cannot have a career and be married, which I think at that time was probably a pretty reasonable belief. So she was very candid and very, and so I was just really lucky to have found this particular resource, because it was like having been able to interview Betty during, in 1950, which is kind of incredible.
Right. Another question. This is the Jewish Book Fair, and it is kind of incredible that the only slot that the Goldbergs was put on Friday nights at 8:00 in the middle of Shabbat.
Yeah, that was something there was actually a lot of discussion about that at the time, that like Gertrude was like, I'm not sure if this is good. She I think it was like a good slot at the time. That changes over TV history. Like, there's a time, definitely later on, it's like Friday is not a good slot, but I think it was generally considered like a pretty good slot. And so she was really torn, because she was like, Friday, but good slot, it's like, so she actually like tried to kind of like fight with them a little, and then also kind of was like, well, if it's good though too. And honestly, she was not like hugely religious herself. She wouldn't, I think she would probably choose work over, if she had to. She would always choose work over anything. So in the end, she would go with it regardless. But yeah, it was a genuine concern, because a huge part of her audience really was Jewish.
You made the point that that there was an early Betty White, and also Mrs. Maisel character Sophie Lennon bears some resemblance to Molly Goldberg.
Yeah, it's vague.
I always wondered who that was, and if there was a similar person. Do you think that's as close as it gets?
Probably. That's such a character of its own now. So it's like, and it's so, and at this point, especially, if you've been continuing to watch, it's so different. But the conceit of the character is extremely similar, which is when we initially meet Sophie, she sort of dresses up as this frumpy character for her performances, and then takes it off. And when Midge goes to visit her at her house, for instance, it's this beautiful Park Avenue house, and she's dressed perfectly, and she has no accent, and the whole thing. And Gertrude really was like this in this sense. She by all accounts, she had like a nice place, but not like a palatial place. But they were on Park, but not like, the Park. But she had brownstone, and but she did dress impeccably. She loved furs and hats and pins and things like this, and spent lots of money on her work, the gloves, the whole thing.
And she did not wear house dresses.
She did not wear house dresses for sure. And also, when you see her interviewed out of character, she is a very careful, what we call a mid-Atlantic accent. This was sort of a thing that people had then, where cultivated people would learn to sort of speak it. If you think of like 40s movie stars, that's often, Katharine Hepburn. She had this very practiced, not an accent at all. Now, when she was Molly Goldberg, she had a Yiddish accent and would use Yiddishisms, and kind of malapropisms were a big thing for her too, because she was supposed to be an immigrant. So that was something that was inherent in her character. And, it's just shocking when you see her, and the hair is done perfectly. And she really wanted people to know that she was this successful, self-made woman, which she has every right to do. And kind of, it's funny because she loved to also play on that character. Like I said, she kind of wanted to have her cake and eat it too, which I think, she worked hard enough to do so. So.
Who would she be if she was living now? I mean, she also became a dramatic actress.
That's another thing is like, and I so wish she had lived longer, because I would have loved to see, maybe she would have just stayed on Broadway, because that seemed really comfortable. It turned out when she finally, she really holds on for a long time. She's on almost every network before she gives up the Goldbergs. But when she gives up the Goldbergs in the late 50s, I think she might have even been a little surprised to learn that people wanted her, even if she wasn't being Molly Goldberg. And she did some dramatic stuff on television, on kind of those like, there were these dramatic anthology shows at the time where it'd be almost like a movie of the week. I watched a few of those at Paley, and they were really fun, starring her. And then she goes to Broadway and was actually having a great second life kind of on Broadway. When she died, she was about to be she had 2 plays in the works. Right. And she had just won a Tony for her dramatic acting on Broadway, which I just find, I think that for so long, and she, of course, loved this character that she had created, and she worked so hard to keep this character alive for essentially 2 decades, both on radio and television. Yeah. And then, but when she lets go, it turns out everybody still loves her and everybody still wants her. And she was having a great run, and she was writing stuff for Broadway. So I think she would have continued to be. This is another reason I think we've forgotten about her. But
wasn't she also the one who had a successful marriage and happy children?
Yes. This is another, I would say, like Betty White's parents, but also Gertrude Berg's husband. It's hard to get people to tell you this, because I think they didn't want to say it at the time. Like now it'd be so cool, like to be able to say like, look at my supportive husband. But I think at the time, like they didn't want to like, she was kind of trying to play on this whole like America's mother thing. So you don't want to remind people that she's a career woman and her husband basically has to support this. But he typed scripts for her. Mm-hmm. And it's unclear who was watching her children when they were growing up, when she was on the radio. They're gone too. So I talked to her grandchildren, and, grandchildren start to get a little vague about what they knew. And they were like, I don't know who took care of took care of my parents. But it seems like probably a combination of her husband, and they had a live-in maid who was, a huge part of their household. Louise, she's the one who actually cooked in the household and sometimes watched the children. But there was, he clearly was this, very supportive man who had an accounting business of his own, but seemed to manage his wife's career a little, would do some business stuff. And, he'd just be there kind of in the background when she'd be doing interviews on TV, like, hey, didn't really say anything. And he really seemed like he was fine with his wife being this. I mean, she's just a force. You have to go watch some stuff with her, because you can just imagine what it must have been like to be in a room with her. She is just all of the attention to her, and she is really, really fun. And so I think he just, I can't imagine that she could have had a successful marriage with anyone else, because most men of that time, there's no way they would cede the spotlight to their wife in even a minor way, much less like that she could have this many decades long career. It's pretty incredible.
There, I think we're I was up against our time limit, but I I I think that the other three women had very mixed success in personal relationships.
Yes, yes. Betty really just
Betty
made
had her parents and
at
her
some
dogs.
point, and she ends up meeting the man of her dreams in
Oh,
the
yeah.
60s. When she's a guest on game shows and meets her husband, who's the host of Password, and they had like a legendary Hollywood marriage. She had seemed to it was perfect, but he obviously supported her career and was
Right.
perfectly happy, but it was a different time by even the 60s.
Right.
And Erna, as we talked about, just, she never met anyone. She said she'd give it all up if she met the right man. But she never did. And
She
so
was a
instead,
little bit of a tortured soul, wasn't
she
she?
really was. She really had she was really stressed out about like whether her kids were okay without a father figure, that sort of thing. But, instead of meeting the right man, she ends up going into the 60s and having something like 7 shows on the air at the same time. I mean, this is a woman who, especially at that time, basically almost every daytime soap opera was either made by her or one of her proteges, because she had trained, she had mentored a number of people by then. So like Days of Our Lives, in addition to The Guiding Light, which ends up being, I believe, the longest running drama in broadcast history because it spans radio and television. So, she did okay for herself. She didn't ever meet the right man.
Right. Well, on that note, I'd like to thank you so much, Jennifer. I wish we could speak longer about your own fascinating career.
Thank you.
But thanks very much for being with us and for a wonderful book.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you, Jennifer and Laura, for being with us for such a wonderful discussion. And thank you, all of you at home, for watching. I'm sure I'm not the only one in this audience who did know who Gertrude Berg was and spent many hours enjoying her shows as a child. Our next event is featuring Michigan author Beth Kirschner to discuss her debut novel, Copper Divide, joined in conversation by Catherine Kangany, Executive Director of the Jewish Historical Society of Michigan. Remember to like this video, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and visit our website, culturalarts.jccdet.org/bookfair for our full schedule and ways to get involved. See you next time.